Welcome to Happy Path Programming. I'm Bruce Eckel.
I'm James Ward.
Welcome. We are interviewing this week our longtime friend Barry Hawkins, who is God. How do you even describe Barry? I don't know what.
He's a unicorn of cultural change.
Oh, I like it.
Yeah.
This needs to go
great.
on your business card.
Unicorn of cultural change. Yes.
Boy, and you just pulled that right out of your head.
Yeah.
I like that.
He is somebody who comes into organizations, is able to see what's holding them back, and then help them through Agile and other things, help them move forward, increase velocity, get rid of roadblocks. So
yeah, and you've been doing a lot of YouTube videos, so you can find his presentations online. But that actually brings me into a question that so there's these two. I don't think model is the right word, but there's this two approaches that you see in consulting, which is the carpet bombing approach, which is somebody comes in and they go, "You're doing everything wrong. Here's the right way to do it." Yes. And then they leave and everybody forgets. And, it's like, it doesn't work. And then there's the way that I think I came to know mostly from Gerald Weinberg's workshops, which I used to take when he was alive, and his book, Secrets of Consulting, which did I turn you on to that book, or did you know about it?
You were the first. You were the first. Yes. Mm-hmm.
And I learned about that from the guy who used to run the first magazine I wrote for, Micro Cornucopia. Anyway, so my experience is that you go into a company and you have to understand what they're capable of in terms of change. Yeah. And usually it's way less than anybody has ambitions for. They're able to successfully change a few little things. And I remember it was you who first quoted to me from, I think it was, I can't remember the name of the book, but you probably will. But it was basically, if you don't have an automated build system, automated testing, and God, what was the other thing? Version control. Then you can't do anything else. You can't move forward. You can't do Agile stuff or anything. You have to have those. And so when you go into a company, the first thing that you do is go, "Oh, do you have these things in place?" "Oh, you don't." "Okay, well, that's what we're going to work on, because if you don't have those foundations, it's pointless." Anyway, my question is, how do you, when you go into a company, how do you understand what they're capable of in terms of change?
I think so. Some of this has to do with what I believe the three of us have in common. And so for those who don't know, the origin story of this little adventuring party is I was at a large client in downtown Atlanta, where I am from, and grew up, in early 2006. And I had software engineering is a second career for me. My first was in the manufacturing space, industrial adhesive and marking systems for a decade. And I transitioned into software full-time in 2000. And as someone coming into the field late, as it were, in my professional journey, I was completely self-taught, but also always on the lookout for good books, because the good, I read many books, but the good books were the ones that really helped me get to that next level. And Bruce's Thinking in Java, I had someone recommend it, a peer at the Atlanta Java User Group recommend it to me, found out, and you can actually check it out online before you buy it, because you could download it. Bruce was a bit of a pioneer in that way. And as I read through it, it spoke to me the way that I had read some other people's books who I won't name because I don't want to offend them, and went all the way through and came to then and thought, still really don't know how equals should be implemented. And so, and the way Bruce would talk through interfaces, inheritance, equality, or is it equivalence? I don't. Anyway, it just resonated with me, and I feel like this is someone who understands that the goal of this book is for me to come away being able to think in Java, that to reason, to act cognitively in Java. And I was actually reading his book and checking out his website at lunch, and there was this post there saying, "I'm going to have a conference called, and it's titled Programming the New Web, and it's going to be in Crested Butte." Now that stood out to me because at that time, my younger brother had moved to Crested Butte about 7 years prior. And my father had bought a house in Crested Butte a couple of years prior. So here I am thinking, I only knew how to pronounce this town's name a couple of years ago. And now, and this guy lives there? What is up with that? And, I could kind of double this up, like the family and I could go, and it could be finally get to see the Colorado house, get to see my brother, and go to a conference. Ugh. So I called up my dad. And I'm like, hey, so there's this guy, you probably haven't, I don't know if you've met him yet, but his name's Bruce, and he lives in Crested Butte, and there's going to be a conference. And I gave the address, not knowing that you don't have to give the address in Crested Butte for someone to know what you're talking about, Right. So I'm like, and it's at this parish hall near Camp 4 Coffee, it says. And I know you guys talk about Camp 4 Coffee all the time. And my dad says, I'm sitting at Camp 4 Coffee and I'm looking at the parish hall right now. So yes, that is here. And so I was like, crap, I don't know.
This is a scam. You're like, this can't be true. That
now it's starting. Now it's like, it might. So this might be a good experience, or he might take my kidneys the first night. And so, so I took a gamble and went and got to know Bruce, and then flash forward.
And Diane was there too. I think that was
Diane Marsh, who's been on the show. She was there. That's where we all met. We all met. That was the first meeting.
Yeah, I don't know if you were there.
No, I'll tell you. No, because then the story progresses forward to August of 2006. And Diane and I were invited to the Enterprise Architecture Summit. What would be actually the final
so this was
official instance, if you don't count the winter sessions, the final instance of the Enterprise Architecture Summit. And I, arrive in Crested Butte, getting all settled, and it's the time before day one, and I'm coming early, as I'm wont to do. And there's this gentleman sitting in an Adirondack chair out in front of Camp 4 Coffee, working on his laptop. And just the fact that there was a laptop, it's like, yeah, it's probably with me. And so I'm like, hey, how's it going? He's like, hey, I'm James. And that was when James and I met.
Awesome.
Okay.
And and so then, James and I were at that open space conference together, started to keep in touch after then. And so it was 2006. It's really the origin story for ourselves and Diane, and what would then, go on to become the Roundup and other things. And when I met James, this is back, James, you were in your RIA days.
Yeah, that's right.
The days of the RIA cowboy. Yeah. And James has always taken a given technology or developer experience and environment, and I feel done a really good job of making it accessible and approachable. I think a recent example, James, is your Kubernetes the easy way.
Yeah, which is a play on Kelsey Hightower's Kubernetes the hard way.
Which is a foil on Kelsey's.
I went through the Kubernetes the hard way one, and I was like, okay, that's cool because I understand Kubernetes, but there is an easy way. And so so I just forked his repo on GitHub and just basically deleted 90% of it. And then that's Kubernetes the easy way.
I love that. And I think that tutorial is an expression of what I think is at the heart of your style and what's one of your superpowers, in developer experience. And so me, the way that I approach development process, product development, and then how that interacts and has to exist within a company culture. The feedback that I've gotten over the years is, I've seen this before, I've heard this before, I've done this 10 different times in different places, but the way that you explained it helped me understand what it was supposed to be a bit more. And so when Bruce talks about, how do you come into a place and, consult, particularly if you're consulting on those topics of, development process and product development and then how that plays into company culture. I think the most important thing is to quickly assess where people are and meet them there. And I think that's, I think, Bruce's writing and James, the work that you do, including your writing, I think you meet people where they are. And that's so important, because if you tell people, you must be at least this high in your bar to approach my offerings.
We're in Colorado. Maybe you should say this tall.
This tall. Yes, I say.
This high.
Yeah, this tall, or get this high and think you're this tall. But it is you have, if you don't meet those people or those groups where they're at, it's a bit of a dice roll. I mean, you can make a lot of money that way, because you scare the crap out of them and they're like, oh my God, this person knows so much. Like, wow, we really are off base. And
like,
we
one
better...
of the things that's been frustrating for me with functional programming is that it's, I think, unintentionally has a lot of gatekeeping.
Yes.
Where it's like, oh, you must understand category theory and crazy amounts of math and all this to do functional programming. And sometimes I think the community, to people that are not this tall, they answer questions in such a way that makes people feel belittled and makes people feel like, oh yeah, you're not that tall, so you can't go on this functional programming ride. And that's been frustrating. And so one of the things that I've been doing, and now doing a lot more with Bruce and through the podcast sometimes, is trying to do what you're saying. Like we can make these concepts approachable and understandable by anyone. We don't have to talk about monads in terms of category theory, even though I kind of enjoy doing that a little bit. But hopefully we can make those functional programming concepts something that everyone can understand. And we've been
making progress. Like, we were at a little conference last week in Marble, which you would have probably enjoyed. And we had no idea, but there were a number of people who were really into functional programming and a number of people who were curious about it. And so we had some really good conversations, and I could see how people who've gone over the hurdle and gotten really into it really are attracted to going towards those details, the very details that scare people off. And being able to see that and kind of understand, it's like, okay, I see why you're going there. It makes you feel good, but that's not helping.
Well, it's interesting pieces as you get in there, but that's also what unintentionally creates the gatekeeping. And so I think that's been one of functional programming's hardest things for gaining broader adoption. And so it's been super fun to work with Bruce and be like, okay, no, we are gonna try really hard to make these ideas attainable by anyone,
right
without going towards math. And
listening to through Happy Path, I do think that is a narrative thread, making functional programming accessible. And it is, and I'll say, I mean, again, as someone who's self-taught, and came to computer programming and software engineering as a second career, I came to call them the deliberate gestures of condescension that I would hit as I met. I'll never forget being in Barnes and Noble. So the late 90s through the early 2000s, my nights were going to Barnes and Noble and looking and seeing what new books were there and which ones were worth buying. And I got my start in Microsoft languages and predominantly Visual Basic for the first years. because it was accessible, and the things that I could get my hands on, without forking out a ton of cash, were available through Visual Basic. And I started to hear about Java, and I'll never forget, I was in an aisle, like looking at books, and then there was this other dude there, and he had a Java book, and I'm like, oh, do you program in Java? And he's like, yeah. And I can't even remember what shibboleth. We've talked about the shibboleth, from Judaic history, the secret password. It was how, I forget if it was the tribe of Benjamin, but, they would ask people to say a word, and the way that they pronounced it versus the way that their enemies would pronounce it would be different, but the people wouldn't know. So if you said it wrong, and then they killed you, I think. But that's kind of the experience of trying to interact with certain software engineering communities. And so I clearly did not say the password right. And he's like, you wouldn't know, you may get there someday, and just walked off. And I was at Barnes and Noble with a friend, and I went and sat down. I was like, getting into programming, I love programming, but so many of the people that I meet in it are, and I don't know if they're all like this, and it was, right. And so I have gravitated towards communities in programming that I found more open and well. I mean, if I hadn't found the Atlanta Java user group, I probably would have bailed on Java.
Yeah,
because they were all so, Burr Sutter, like what he did there for years. They were so welcoming and inviting. Yeah. And I think with functional programming, functional programming makes sense to me. In fact, when I first heard about, but when I first really started to think about functional programming, it made a lot of sense to me because it resonated with Eric Evans in domain-driven design, his side effect-free functions.
Yeah.
It seemed to be like, hey, side effect-free functions is endemic to functional programming. And that's a good thing, because when I worked with Eric doing domain-driven design coaching, the amount of effort we would have to do to try to get people to write side effect-free functions in Java was no small feat. Mm-hmm. And so it just ostensibly, philosophically, it made sense. And when I heard,
I didn't know that Eric Evans and domain-driven design had any concept of side effects, and I need to go reread it.
Oh, you should totally go to the chapter on side effect-free functions. And to me,
whoa,
yeah, I think I'm pretty sure
for our book.
I could, yeah, I could try and look it up.
Right behind him.
Yeah, right next to Bruce's Thinking in Java. Though, yeah, I have the books of people who've influenced me the most is actually what I line the back of my video backdrop with. And Bruce's, I have the version of Thinking in Java that Bruce signed. It's unfortunate because the condo that we lived in Santa Monica, where it was like a greenhouse, the sun has bleached out the cover. So if the color looks off, apologies. That's a bit of a sidebar. There's nothing more fun on a podcast than having someone describe a visual situation. But functional programming made a lot of sense. But as I tried to approach it, the amount of intellectual arrogance was that, I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, I have been someone who's done that in my own, field and own endeavor. And then you start to see the impact of it. And you have to ask yourself, what am I here to do? What am I trying to do here? Because if I say to myself that I'm trying to help more people do this thing, but I'm constantly alienating, driving off, and making people feel less than in the way that I'm trying to bring them in, you can be right and very alone. And the surest way to do that is to be
somebody else's candle to make yours brighter.
Yes. Yeah. So it's one of the things that I've liked as I've listened to you guys dialogue about functional programming in the podcast.
Yeah. It's been fun for us.
Ideally, well, I know all of us have done that kind of thing in our life, and ideally we've all come to be embarrassed about it later in our lives. It's not, it's just
normal human.
That was the best we could do at the time, as awkward as it turned out to be.
Doing the best with what we had and where we were at the time. Yep.
Mm-hmm.
But thank heavens for growth. So,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And for friends that can help you see those things.
help you along the way. Yeah, I have to say, I will say that the two of you, there have been, I can think of notable moments where things that the two of you said or did helped, nurture that realization and awareness in me. So I'm thankful for that.
Ditto.
Yeah, we've all had some really interesting.
I mean,
It's really satisfying to be able to talk with someone who gets you. It's like just I don't know, because anyway, it just is. So you're kind of now restarting your consulting business.
Yeah. Having moved, transitioned out of the last place, I'm going back into consulting, and the last 9 years has been an interesting experiment. So, I guess in a nutshell, transitioning from the industrial space into software engineering, when I went from the manufacturing sector and what is basically a mechanical engineering endeavor, and I got into software, I was blown away. Disillusioned, one might say.
Engineering it is.
At how non-engineering, I mean, like when I learned about people like, programming and developing with the debugger open, setting all the breakpoints and crap, and trying to do that myself. And I had the fortunate mental model of having to make systems in the, packaging and marking systems in the physical world. So I have always had a highly observable, short feedback loop on what I was trying to do, because when that sheet of steel is flying by at 120 feet a minute and you have to put a barcode on it, it is real easy to figure out whether or not you're doing what you want, because if that barcode reader downstream doesn't read that, it's not working. And you need to make the changes to make that happen. And then, I transitioned into software, and it was such an eye-opening. The plasticity and the malleability of software also allows us to cover a multitude of sins as far as like what we're not observing and our ability to make up for it later, or try to make up for it later. And so I did, in the manufacturing world, my break into software was I wrote to software applications that ran in factory floors. Pro tip for anybody, if you're a time traveler, do not go back to the late 90s and write industrial manufacturing applications in Visual Basic. Hacking together a serial driver.
Things are like flying off like the.
That was where I first internalized, okay, there are limitations. This language is not suited for everything. You hear people talk about, Visual Basic, it'll solve 80%. And I know I'm talking in a past era, but Visual Basic will solve 80% of the problems. Trying to use it for the other 20%, you'll go insane. And I did, actually. Because my second application was, if you remember when photo services were a big deal, like Shutterfly and all that. Yeah. We ended up with a client who they wanted us to deliver a system where they had the web app where you put in your photos and captions, and their killer thing was you actually could put like 254 characters of description, because most things, you just got the date, or you could put like a little, phrase. Well, they had the ability to do like a little paragraph, and this system had to take the photos in sync with how they had been uploaded, and they would, on the photo, they would print a 2D barcode below in the white space that would be trimmed off once they processed the photo. But I had to write an application that interfaced with a hardware-based 2D scanner, read that barcode, decoded it into a string, fed that string into an inkjet printer to then generate a message binary and print. While this stuff was flying by, I can't remember. I think we got it up to like 30 or 40 feet a second, which was fast for what we were doing. But This is again first two software. It's a very formative experience signing myself up for this.
Yeah.
Because
and back then there were no like APIs you could call.
No, God no.
Probably very few libraries to use. Like
I found a book for mail order that was writing serial drivers in Visual Basic. There was one book in the world that I could find. Using that and not sleeping for 3 days and hacking together a serial driver to interface that, it nearly killed me, but it also taught me a lot about, okay, here's how software engineering is similar and different to my prior life. But oh my God, the lack of observability of the system was maddening. Like trying to debug that serial driver and setting breakpoint in it. I was like, I got to find a better way than this. And so I then transitioned fully into software. I wrote those two applications in the end of my time in manufacturing, and then switched over to software full time. And that was when I first learned of waterfall, when someone wasn't referring to the land feature. And as I watched that kind of opacity, people programming in that degree of opacity at scale, with waterfall, I started to really question my career transition. Like, what have I done to myself?
Well, in some ways, waterfall comes from the manufacturing world. Is that right? Or like, is there a relationship there?
It comes from a misunderstanding of the manufacturing world. That's what I tell software people is the I hear people say about manufacturing who've only ever been in software, and it is hilarious to me because stuff changes all the time and you get no heads up. Like there'll be a raw material, right? This was a real story. I worked with my father. The decade that I was in mechanical, I worked with my father in a company he started, and we designed and sold turnkey systems for manufacturing to print and adhese things. And there was a system that we had that was built on a particular class of adhesives that were really effective. And we're living our life. We had sold dozens of these manufacturing systems that were producing tens of thousands of carpet sample trays, actually. And we suddenly start getting calls from the manufacturers, like, all of the carpet. So this truck just got to Houston and all of the carpet has fallen out of the trays. So this crap is being shipped, it's been created and it's being shipped all over the US. And long story, at the end of it, what we learned was the chemical manufacturer who made the adhesive, they had changed the formula of the adhesive without telling anyone. And that happens in manufacturing all the time. And you just become CSI manufacturing edition, trying to find out, all right, who did what in that particular story. Here's how wild manufacturing is, and here's how many parallels from software there are. It turned out that adhesive was made, the core active ingredient in that adhesive was made from a byproduct of a really messy, horrible petroleum refinement process. And so they had lakes of this sludge out in rural areas, and they found a use for it in this adhesive. But then when they used up all the sludge lakes, there wasn't any more of it because it was actually a byproduct of a bad thing they had stopped doing. So manufacturing has way more similarity to software than we might realize. But the lack of observability and feedback loops is what sent, and then seeing like it at scale in waterfall is what led for me to begin searching for, oh my God, there has to be another, like, surely to God, not everybody's doing it this way. And that started in earnest in 2001. In 2002, I started to learn a bit about XP. By 2003, I then learned about...
Okay, say what XP is, because I've read a lot.
Thank you. XP, it's not... I'm not talking about what happens in Skyrim as you kill things.
Okay. Not about the Windows
XP,
version.
extreme programming. And Agile, for those who don't know, when people talk about Agile, which I'm sure we'll traverse into at some point.
Yes.
Agile is an umbrella term coined in 2001 for a constellation of methodologies and experiments and approaches that groups of software, predominantly software engineering practitioners, had undertaken, because they too felt like, boy, this whole waterfall model is a horrible fit for the craft of actually making software. And XP Extreme Programming, headed up by Kent Beck, but a number of luminaries there. It was one of the first. Scrum was in, XP in 1995, Scrum in 1994, but all these pockets, Crystal, ASD, DSDM, they all
Star
were
methodology from Sun.
Star. Yep. Yeah. There was a whole constellation of these experiments. And so XP was one of them. And I started hearing about all of that.
Hang on, I want to interject something as long as we're talking about waterfall. I just read a really nice article by Kevlin Henney that he just put up, where he talks, I think I sent you a link to it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, where he talks about why, where waterfall does work. And so it kind of explains, here's, it's not just massively stupid. It's like, within a lot, if you have a lot of constraints, it can work, and this is why it exists at all. And I found that to be very useful. So anyway, go on.
Yeah, no, Kevlin, and Kevlin's a really good historian. Kevlin Henney and Craig Larman, to me, are some of the most effective historians of software methodology. But it's really interesting. After some years in Agile, I began to myself just forensically try to figure out, how did we get here? The waterfall as a methodology, the name waterfall, in the waterfall paper that was written in 1970, the word waterfall is nowhere in it. The name came from the third diagram in the problem statement. And that diagram is actually part of articulating the problem statement of misunderstandings about software. But people took that, went with it, and it got the name waterfall because it's like, oh, look, the diagram has rectangles going, diagonally from top left to bottom right. And they're like, look, it looks like everything just, it's like Cascade. Water, everything just rolling downhill like water, and like the further away you are from the top, or the further away you are from the bottom, the easier your life is. And so, waterfall, there's some really interesting quotes. One in a paper from 1965 by Herbert Bennington. Then interesting quotes in, I can't believe I'm blanking on his name. I say it all the time. Royce, the author of Winston W. Royce, I think it is, the author of the waterfall paper. But when you actually go and read the papers, they didn't believe it. Waterfall was originally called top-down programming. That was the cool term from the mid 60s into the early 70s was actually top-down programming, and most of the diagrams actually drew it from the rectangles were skinnier and they ran vertically down, and it was called top down. And so when Winston W. Royce took the alternate approach and spaced the boxes out, which arguably is more readable, waterfall came from, it looks like a waterfall. So it's really wild to dig into the history of how we came to do so many of the things that we do. But even, in those people, the Navy paper from the 60s, and the Royce's paper from 1970. Royce, he in the opening he says these are reflections on my the past 9+ years of working on software systems as part of the lunar landing mission.
Huh.
So just think about that. Okay, so definite hardware and software integration. Right?
Yeah, you don't get an integration test.
That was all assembly language.
And he even there, that's what's wild, is to go back to these papers in the 60s and 70s, because they'll say you have to do this in units. and you have to have tests that affirm that each of the units is working before you move on to assemble it into the larger system. They had short, tight feedback loops. They actually did. They didn't call it refactoring, but they did refactor. They would say implement it once and go back and implement it again. So they were iterating
Where did
even
waterfall
then.
go wrong? Where did waterfall go wrong?
Oh heavens! It's it's when we started calling it
When did we
waterfall.
fall off the cliff? When did the waterfall fall off the cliff?
The waterfall went off the cliff, and many people with it, when it got the name waterfall. It's to me, the waterfall paper. And James, I was thinking about when you were talking with Sharon in the episode on Vibe and Heroku, and you were talking about what I took away from what you all were saying is it's important to write things down, but there's a peril in writing things down.
Yes,
because once it's written down,
it's like a metaphor. Where I read a book, it was a philosophy book about metaphors, and it said that metaphors are helpful because they help us to constrain the way that we see something, but naturally that also hides some reality that we can't see anymore. And so I think you're right that maybe like the name gave us a metaphor for this thing, which then helped us to understand it, made it something easier to grasp, but then also hid a bunch of reality or something.
Well, it's like any abstraction. You have to be careful of what you're hiding and what you're exposing.
Yes. Well, and that's
so waterfall, when we named it waterfall, maybe the abstraction, we lost something important.
So the waterfall paper is a short paper. I don't think it's much over 10 pages. It's a white paper from a conference. This was, in the days before slides, right?
Yeah.
So it's relatively brief. Here's where waterfall went wrong. The waterfall that everyone talks about and the way that they diagram and model it is from the third diagram in the problem statement.
Yeah.
It is not from the 10 recommendations that make up the second half of the paper.
Huh.
If you look at the 10 recommendations that make up the second half of the paper, they are all 100% compatible with what we espouse today as incremental, iterative, agile before the dilution, it's the good stuff. So, but there are two things that I think of.
But there's no word for those things that I can like wrap my head around. So that's why I just stuck on page third diagram is because it had a name.
It had a name and it had a picture, and it's where W. Edwards Deming said in the 50s or 60s, if you give something a name, people will expect you to hand it to them in a box. And I also think of Eric Evans talking about in domain-driven design, talking about models and what makes for a useful model. And what makes for a useful model is it's an abstraction that suits the purpose that you're trying for which you're trying to use it. But our penchant as humans is to want to take an abstraction or a model. We crave simplification, and we will do our damnedest. I don't think that'll get an explicit tag. To try and over apply an abstraction, and that's I think the trouble with waterfall is one, what everybody seized on was part of the problem statement, not the recommendations. And that problem statement, if you are in a command and control hierarchy, the waterfall model, the part of the problem statement that they seized on is incredibly seductive.
Mm-hmm.
The idea that I can declare a direction and then we're going to spend enough time laying out a plan and we will follow that plan.
And nothing will change.
Flawlessly, and nothing will change. Because if you look at the third diagram and then you go to the fourth and the fifth actually show. Now here's where that goes wrong. It actually shows but you get to this step and you find out that there's something wrong. It's important that each of these steps be tightly coupled and that you iterate between each step. It actually says iterate between each step. And it says, and two, you can do all that right and still get to the test before go live, the test before ship, and find not that there was a bug in the code, but rather some of what you were trying to do was not what you should have been trying to do. And then he says, now, therefore, do these 10 things. And the 10 things are all 100% compatible with, incremental, iterative, agility, all that. But everybody stopped at the problems. It's so for me, the moral
in some ways, what you're saying is that it's like Conway's law, but it's Barry's law, and it's that your methodology, your software methodology, also models your organizational structure.
Absolutely. And that's what led me to write. And I talked about it and actually a lot with you guys for years before I finally wrote it and put it on the internet. Because God knows once you put something on the internet, it's like buckle up. But when I wrote The Myth of Commoditized Excellence, the myth of commoditized excellence is my expression of this is the perilous journey that anyone trying to do a good and helpful and share a good and helpful thing faces. Is that the people who benefit the most and with whom the thing you're doing, with whom it resonates the most, are oftentimes the people you have to watch out for the most, because they will take that thing and try to over apply it, evolve it begin to morph it. I was about to say pervert it to their own means, weaponize it, really. I mean, that's a lot of what happened with Agile. It's what happens with the minute you write a culture statement. Culture statements are some of the most immediately weaponized things in a company. It's I can get in a lot of trouble talking about that, but anyway.
Well, I would say, so this is something I've been kind of slowly developing, which is, and it may exist already because there's lots of cognitive biases, but I don't think I've seen it, which is what I call the simplicity bias, which is this desire to, simplify everything. And I don't know if you've looked into Occam's razor.
Yes.
And if you've seen Occam's razor, like represented in popular media, they'll say, Occam's razor says that the simplest solution is the right one. And it doesn't, I looked it up, it doesn't say that at all.
No.
It says, if you have two or more approaches to take, try the simplest one first. It's just a strategy. And it makes sense because it's like, well, you'll learn a lot. If it fails, you can do the more complicated one. But if it works, then you haven't wasted all that time. Totally different. But this desire for simplicity is so great that, I think that's what gave us economics, is this idea that, there could be equations that predict the future of the economy. Let's pretend that there are, and then we'll go from there. And it came from, all of these things come from, and I think,
let's pretend that humans are simple.
Humans are simple. They got some basic laws, and we'll just guess what they are, and then, go on from there. And, those turned out to be completely wrong. But my point was that, that I think one of the things that maybe the whole Agile Scrum movement didn't take into account was psychology. That they didn't wrap that in.
Like how it would be weaponized, or
that it would be that, there were all these other factors, and it was just, all you have to do is, rapid iterations and simple this and simple that, and then it'll work great. And I feel like you encountered in a lot of your consulting jobs, people, falling prey to this. Anyway, say something.
Absolutely. That's, I remember talking to Esther Derby, and I were, there was a speaker event at the Norwegian Developer Conference, Oslo, 2012, June of 2012. And it was a long but very pleasant walk through Oslo from the venue to where we were going on this boat. And we went out into the fjord and had these really cool sandwiches and stuff. And Esther and I were talking about some of the challenges of helping teams and organizations succeed with their, desire for more agility. And we were talking about the history of lean, and just the things that led to lean, and basically and I remember Esther saying, well, essentially at the heart of it is the Agile ecosystem stumbled into lean just by deductive reasoning. looking at let's try something, see what works, throw away what doesn't. And at the end of the day, it turns out that having small, autonomous, self-organizing teams that have a highly observable work system that they can inspect and adapt generally works out really well. But what happened and this is where Agile is both beautiful and strong and weak in that it came to be and really took its initial shape, and its shape for some time largely only with software engineers involved who didn't have to deal with the rest of what's involved in being an organization. So as they began to, and I talk about this in some of the training that I give, is one of the things, and oh God, if Martin and I hope they all don't get mad, but so I'll just, me as someone coming to the party late and then observing and just and having the great fortune to talk to some of the people who wrote that manifesto and who were part of XP and Scrum in the early days, as I in my amateur forensic archaeologist, forensic sociologist, try to put together what happened here. When they went to try and share what they were doing, I think one of the things that the initial XP and Scrum, but also Crystal, ASD, DSDM folks, one of the things that they took for granted was the culture that they had. As a group of self-selecting programmers who often did work together, were brought into places and airdropped in to work together, and then they would go off and go work somewhere else together, or maybe just some of their other buddies this time. But they were sort of airdropping in with their own little cultural orb.
And they were a small subset of the general programming
population.
Right.
Now, when they then tried to take that and say, now, other people can do it, most of what they captured and documented were the discretely observable events and artifacts.
Not realizing the water that they were in.
Not realizing the water at all. And so in one of my trainings that I have called Agile Foundations, which is focused on Agile at the team level, the nuclear, the cellular unit, I have a whole section on the underlying cultural assumptions of Agile, because what I found over years, now coming up to 20 years of doing this at everywhere from 5-person startups to Fortune 100 companies, is what most people are trained on or they hear is simply the mechanics of Agile. And it's presented to them as, take this, repeat these mechanics, no matter where you're sitting, it'll be awesome. 100% not true. If you look at the people who, go back and look at the people who created these things, look at what they were doing then, look at what they're doing now. Most of them are luminaries. They're the people who gave us refactoring and unit testing and continuous integration and continuous delivery. They were the persons on the teams. So to think that you could just take the discretely observable, like plan a sprint, have a daily stand-up, review it, have a retrospective. You can't just drop that in anywhere. Like
the environment that you're doing this in,
yes,
and all the other forces that are acting on you. It's like it's like all of a sudden we're like, oh, gravitational waves. Like there are other things that are like having an impact on all of this stuff that we haven't admitted or even been aware of.
Well, and I would say that there's also a fundamental, I guess I'd call it a psychological thing that we don't usually talk about, but is underneath all of this, which is that we have this belief that we can make, if the meeting is long enough, or if we think about it long enough, I fall prey to this all the time, that we can figure it out.
Yeah.
We can figure out the solution ahead of time.
Yeah.
And so this shift is more than just, oh yeah, that little simple thing you've been doing it wrong. No, this is like a fundamental belief system that needs to be changed. And if everybody is stuck on this idea, which we mostly are, of, oh yeah, we can figure it out ahead of time, then we're going to end up with something like waterfall.
Yeah, or the the perversions of Agile and Scrum that happen. One of the first things that I ask companies and people when they first want to talk to me about this stuff is, I'll say, great. So how do you approach planning and projection right now? And I just have them describe it to me, and I say, oh, great, okay. What would you say your comfort level is with uncertainty and volatility?
Mm-hmm.
And and I have it as an open-ended, just talk to me, just unpack that for me. I'm
trying
curious
to understand the environment and all of the forces that are acting that people are maybe not aware of.
Yes, because to your point about the water, they very often are not aware of the water. And I'll give you a really polarizing or I guess extreme example. Is I was delivering that Agile Foundations training in a quite large and successful organization, still successful over a decade later. And I was I got to this part about underlying cultural assumptions. And whenever I give this material, the first part I'm going through like the origin story, of Agile, and then the roles, events, artifacts, the discretely observable things. And then I get to, all right, let's pick up with underlying cultural assumptions. The palpable tension in the room. When I get to that part, you can just hear people's sphincters torquing, when I start to say these things. And I was in one group, like I say, big successful company, really, arguably like cool company culture kind of dealio. And I get to the part where I talk about motivated self-directed teams. I talk about that as one of the underlying cultural assumptions of Agile, is that you have people who have the desire and have the degree of autonomy and personal accountability to want to show up and deliver outcomes. They understand that, we're here to deliver outcomes, not to just suck down smoothies and occasionally go play foosball. Like we're here to deliver an outcome. We want to have fun, but this is not day camp. This is work. And I was talking about motivated self-directed teams and like the degree of self-organization and how there's the trust contract in the effective use of these things is for leadership or the people who have to request the outcomes to focus on requesting an outcome, but then to afford the team, the people doing the work, the agency to determine the approach to accomplishing the outcome. And that then the other side of that is, of course, accountability for the outcome. And there was an executive in this session, because I always mix when I'm, to Bruce's question at the start around how do you assess? One of the ways that I do is I make these sessions intentionally a mix from executive down to, individual team members, because I want to see how they interact with one another. And so we were going through this motivated self-directed teams, and this VP actually stopped. He's like, hey, so you're saying that we should just tell people like, this is what you need to accomplish and just let them go accomplish it. I said, exactly.
That's
thinking
crazy.
He was
Right.
affirming me. He's like, these idiots, you can't trust these idiots to do anything. If you don't ride their backs, they won't get done. And we've got 45 minutes left of the class. It's like,
Right.
where do we go from here? You've just said you don't trust, and that you actually called them idiots, and you have said
he was quoting Adam Smith.
you intend to ride their backs. The path forward is you're going to ride their backs. But we're talking about preserving agency, helping, building a sense of team cohesion.
What a delightful place to work.
Yeah. And like I say, this is a place. I'm not about to say it, but if you knew the place, and if you knew the place back then, to think that an executive would have said that out loud in a setting with some of the people that
not even being aware that there's something wrong with saying that.
that's like, oh my God, yeah, like what are you doing? Even if that's what you're thinking, what are you doing? And that's in a lot of. I think at the end of the day, and this is one of the things I also talk about with a product development approach or methodology, is it's important to get to the motivation. because in general, when people are looking to take a different approach, you want to look at, for the people who are paying for this, for the people who are paying for you to come in, what are their motivations for bringing you in? And if you talk to them and it sounds like, ooh, this Agile seems like a more effective way for me to squeeze more blood from my little patch of turnips, that's not going to go well. When I encounter that in initial conversations, I'll tell them, I can understand your interest and appeal, but I will tell you that this is probably not a good use of your money, because I don't see this going very well.
Huh. Seems like maybe we need a Ted Lasso software methodology.
You know what? I love the more recent episodes of Ted Lasso, because I think Ted Lasso is so, what people have seen in the first season and in the episodes up until about 2 or 3 ago is so compelling. But I think what's interesting in recent episodes and the path forward is as Ted has to now become a whole person, and we have to see, the rest of Ted. I wonder how many of the effusive posts that I'm seeing on LinkedIn are going to persevere, because I do think that desire for simplicity. We also want people to be simple. We just bring your best self, bring your best side to work or discussions about things. Don't talk about what makes you anxious or the damage you've suffered that may color or make certain kinds of collaboration or trust hard for you. And there's
a term
hard
that I like a lot, which is, you may have heard this, toxic positivity.
Oh, toxic positivity is one of the most subtle cultural poisons.
Mm-hmm.
Because in toxic positivity it is requesting that you be not your whole self, but in such a polite way that seems rude to refute. And to me, that's one of the things that makes it the most subtle, awful things. It's like, hey, I'm just completely lovable and approachable. Will you please just be a husk of yourself? Only the good bits, please. It's like, whew, that is, you look like a bad guy pooping on that, but you need to, because it's not healthy. Anyway, that's there.
So one of your recent articles is the 4 outcomes of an effective development process, and I'm curious if you could just recap those for us.
Absolutely. And this is where what I found myself needing to do in talking about development process, product development approach. I over the years have needed to be able to concisely express, because again, if there's any lesson I took away from the waterfall paper, is your problem elaboration statement can't go too long, or people will think you're talking about the solution. So with effective development process, there are 4 key outcomes that we're looking for. 1, we want to cultivate an understanding of a team's schedulable capacity, because at the end of the day, most software teams, you got a group of people asking them to do some things to some software, either make it or evolve it, right? And for me, always one of the most anxiety-inducing parts of programming is having to tell people how big I think something is and how long I think it'll take.
Yeah.
Because I immediately, I'm then faced with my own comfort with the unknown.
But it's just an estimate. We're not going to hold you to that.
But even when I know that, even when I've had situations where it's a safe space, I can still feel my butt tighten up, when it's like, is this 2 story points or 20?
Well, why are you asking me for these schedules if you don't care about it?
Well, and you do care. Well, and that's the thing is, we do care about it. It's just, but how real are we going to be about how precise we can be? And that's where I don't talk about a sprint commitment like Scrum does. I talk about the projection. Because even with 2 weeks, you're projecting what you think it's going to be. There's still stuff you don't know, even inside of 10 business days.
Where I feel fear or anxiety around commitment, the word commitments, or giving somebody a estimation on when a project's going to be done, is I know that I'm going to have to go back to them and be like, I was wrong about that.
Yes.
And that, like, knowing that I'm going to have to go back and admit that I was wrong about something. That's like just the anxiety of that, I think is hard.
Well, and we tend to want to, be a little bit optimistic about these things.
Right.
Or a lot optimistic.
I'm usually a lot optimistic. Yeah.
A great amount of optimism. So the first key outcome, cultivate an understanding of schedulable capacity, because the more comfortable a team is with directional commitment and projection, and the more comfortable we are with this, and this is another thing that I reinforce with teams, is when we have to come and say, all right, this is larger than we thought it was going to be. One of my first questions is, unpack for the rest of us. What have you learned? What are we learning? And that there's almost always an awesome answer to that. It's like, it turns out that one of the APIs that we call, it has a caching layer that we can't affect. And so we're having to work around an immovable object underneath us. It's like, oh my God, that's so great to know. As opposed to, so you didn't make the sprint? No, they didn't, fool. But if you beat on that, what you're reinforcing there, when you do that, what you encourage people to do is hide what you found. Hide what you found, pretend it's okay. And that is just, it's not a good thing. So the second key outcome is building cohesion. That is, effective development process should reinforce and create the space for a team of people to understand that they really are a team and they belong together, and that they have a purpose in being together, and that and particularly in cross-functional teams where there's more than one skill involved, developing empathy and understanding for those other skills is a healthy and great thing, and can help you be effective as a group, more effective as a group, the more you understand one another. And some of my more dramatic examples of that are in video game development, where you're literally bringing together artists and engineers and designers, right? Because the difference in skill is just so great. But even in mainstream product development teams where you've just got, back end, front end, or full stack, and QA and UX folks, even there, having better conversations can lead to just amazing breakthroughs and discoveries before it goes to market. And you're crapping the bed. The third key outcome is preserving agency. And that's what I mean by, when I talk about preserving agency in development process, every individual on the team should feel that they have a voice, in fact, a primary voice, in determining how they're going to approach the work and how big they think it is. Because there's no one, I don't care what project management methodology or, I won't name individual, but what software engineering person thinks they've come up with the perfect algorithm to determine how long it should take someone to do something. Those people, and this is a thing that goes back to Deming. This goes back to Deming's and Schuhart's work in the 1940s and 1950s. The people who know the most about the work are the ones closest to it, because they are dealing with realities. And this is the problem with hands-off architects, right? They have a nostalgic view of how easy their model is going to be to implement, because they're not there on the front line hitting these stupid caching problems or these intractable APIs that seem to have been, written by a water buffalo. And you have to trust those people. And the way that you preserve that agency is to give them that voice. And that's where it's so important to say, outcome, let them tell you about the approach. If the approach seems like, oh gosh, this is bigger than, this has a greater cost than we thought it would be. Well, let's have a dialogue. Can we morph the outcome? You initially said it had to also include refunds. If people can just do orders and then we could get refunds a month later, would that be okay? Well, yeah, that'd totally be okay. Okay, well, that makes it a lot smaller, actually. Great. Now we're interacting, right? Now the people asking for outcomes and the people who can do it, we're interacting. We're in dialogue with one another. we both have a voice, and that's more effective than what you see in so much other development process. And here's the, and then for the skeptics, right? For the people like, well, I don't care. I don't have to, my people don't have to have a voice. They just have to do what I say. What I say to those leaders, to the command and control micromanagers, is let's just put on your selfish goggles for a minute. Let's say you don't think that the agency of the individual cares. Well, here's the thing. When you rob individuals of agency, the normal adult human coping response is to detach oneself from the quality of the outcome. If I have no say in how I'm supposed to approach this, and if I have no say in how long that I think it should take, then I am going to do something to cope with this and continue to receive a paycheck. I'm probably going to start taking some recruiter calls. But what I do, the fact that it is, going to be a steaming platter of is not my problem, because you said it had to be done this way, and you said it had to take this long. Well, guess what? That's what this way and that long gets you.
Yeah.
And you hide it, right? So you detach yourself from the quality of the outcome.
You have to just detach, because
and you hide, right? It's like, I know they're going to freak out about it, so I'm just going to hide it until hopefully I can get onto another team or get another job, and then that stuff can blow up when I'm not here, and they can deal with it. So that's why. So even if you are one of those titans of industry, it really does behoove you to not force people to hide stuff and do work that they know is garbage. Now the four, this is hilarious, because I have had to recite the four of these for almost a decade now, and I guess in the moment I am completely blanking on the fourth one. Why is that?
Oh, we can make it a game.
That's
where
right.
We try to guess.
Nurturing critical thought about team effectiveness. That is, and I've heard, Bruce has mentioned Esther Derby and retrospectives, a lot on here. The most, in fact, all flavors of Agile development process, if you look at the School of Process Control, the study of process control, all of those are different flavors of what is classified as empirical process control. And the core pillars of empirical process control, an empirical process control system has to have three things. It has to have transparency, that is visibility into the work and how it's moving through the system, and the system is a team. Inspection, the ability to inspect that, use that transparency in order to inspect, and adaptation. And a common anti-pattern that I see in Agile and Scrum implementations is that they don't realize that the retrospective, and having an effective retrospective at the end of every development cycle, that is the inspection and the adaptation. So if that's not happening, you're asking for all this transparency with no ability to inspect and adapt. And so a retrospective is not meant to be a group shaming exercise of, what did we get done? Well, begrudging approval. But what did we not get done? And disappointed dad face, and let's have a conversation in a small room about that, or a Zoom for an hour. No, it's supposed to be a conversation. The way that I frame a retrospective is, let's have a conversation on how we did it being a team this cycle. How did we do it?
Fascinating with these things, how it's like the same activity can be completely different depending on the context in which you do it, or the attitude with
the goals.
Context is everything.
Yeah, which you don't necessarily, goals and beliefs that you don't even necessarily know that you're carrying around with you.
Yeah. And
it totally changes the
100%.
the experience of it. And so
that's why so much of Agile is not good.
Yeah.
To say controversial, or maybe not controversial, but a lot of the majority of what I see in Agile situations that I'm, brought in to help remediate or improve, they've heard that, recite these mechanics, or even just, and the tools, oh my Lord, the tools that, tout themselves as, Agile project management tools. the degree to which they systemically reinforce some of the most heinous anti-patterns that you could have. Tempted to name names, but I won't.
I guess part of what you're saying is that there's the mechanics, but you have to also understand the motivations that exist or that are there and not admitted, and try to understand what maybe your motivations should be.
It's like the mechanics are just the top 20% of the iceberg.
Yeah.
And everything else, which is, we're dealing with people here, and they all come with their own beliefs and motivations and desires. And that's most of what's going to drive this thing.
The number of times I have to reiterate the Agile Manifesto's 4 points, and I use it. I wait until there's a situation happening, and it's like I'll have one game producer who's like, our Jira template needs to be like this, and everyone should only interact through tickets and their transitions in a workflow. And I'll reiterate, remember, the first bullet point is favoring individuals and their interactions with one another over processes and tools. Eric Evans talks about with domain-driven design is in software, most of us seem to be laboring under the misapprehension that our goal is to eventually develop a system where we won't have to interact with one another at all. And that's not the goal.
Software development in a bubble.
With when I talk about Agile development process and an effective development process, that favoring individuals and their interactions with one another over processes and tools, Occam's, to use Occam's razor as intended, is to begin with try the most minimalist, just enough of a structure and a system to allow work to flow through and have it be observable. Get that to a point of effectiveness and go no further. Leave the rest of our intellectual and emotional bandwidth to interact with one another and make the thing that we're being paid to come here and make. Let's have most of our bandwidth go there, not to more charts and graphs.
If you don't make rules, everything will go off the rails.
Yes.
Yeah, and we need rules, because otherwise bad things will happen.
Yes.
It's funny because
if you can't measure it, you can't manage it.
You can't manage what you can't measure. One of the things that has been an insight for me with the conferences is I always thought that they were about sharing technological insights with each other, and then realizing that, it's actually about connection. And what we do with open spaces is we provide the very minimalist structure necessary to get that going, and then we step away and let everybody at the conference, run with it. And that has taught me, first of all, you need to know what your purpose is. And then what you want to put in place is just enough to make that happen.
We have a discomfort as people spending very much time defining the problem. We want to jump to solving the problem. And as a result, because we haven't spent the time defining, we jump to a solution that's based on myriad assumptions that it turns out some of them were misguided. I think that's part of the problem too with it, with a lot of agile adoptions, agile transformations. I think transformation is a misnomer for the undertaking. It's really more of a transition, and how far that transition goes depends on a lot of factors. But if the belief is, put this stuff in, and our lack of trust is going to get better. Put this stuff in, and we won't micromanage as much, or micromanagement will be easier. We'll
have the right mechanics to micromanage better.
Yes, yeah, and I do experience on a pretty regular basis leadership and engineering management folks who, as they surface pain points to me, and I'm like, well, tell me more about that, and we keep talking. It's like, you thought You thought this was a micromanagement framework. Oh my gosh. This was supposed to be you loosening up. Oh my. Okay, well, let's see where we go from here.
Mm-hmm. See if there is change possible.
Yeah, I mean, I can see very often you being brought in from management wanting basically better tools for command and control.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah,
that is, and it's what I talk about, myth of commoditized excellence. There's no small amount of money been made by people applying some of these methodologies, mindsets, and approaches as tools for just that. Mm-hmm. And it sucks, but it's real. And
it's the management landscape if you want to make money as a management consultant, invent something that seems to solve a perceived problem. It doesn't have to solve it because you'll be gone by the time people figure that out. But you can sell them the dream. That's
the commoditized excellence, right? Mm-hmm. It's like it's Deming's, give something a name. People expect you to hand it to him in the box, and as long as you're out before they open the box and get to the bottom, you're probably going to be okay.
That's maybe a good place. There's tons more we could talk about.
Yeah, I see where.
Seems like that might be a good punctuation to
this was
end
fun.
This session with.
I mean, we can talk to you for days.
Yes,
you guys, you bring this out in me. Yeah, same here with y'all. This feels good. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you,
we'll
Barry.
have to do this again for sure.
Definitely.
Let's.
All right. Thank you.
Thank y'all.
Bye.
Bye.